Like to turn to our keynote speakers and introduce Rob Henken and Jason Stein of Wisconsin Policy Forum. Rob Henken is the president of Wisconsin Policy Forum, a position he has held since 2008. Since joining the forum, Rob has authored or co-authored 5 reports that won national awards from the Governmental Research Association. Rob was selected as the 2019 Person of the Year Award by the Milwaukee Rotary Club and received the 2019 Ally Award from the Hispanic Professionals of Greater Milwaukee. Before he became forum president, Rob worked in Milwaukee County government for nearly 10 years, serving as Director of Research for the County Board and Director of Health and Human Services and Director of Administrative Services. Prior to moving to Milwaukee in 1994, he worked for 7 years on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. as a senior aide to 2 congressmen and as staff director for a House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. So Rob is quite skilled and experienced. His associate, Jason Stein, is research director of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, where he focuses on state and local government out of the group's Madison office. Before joining the forum, Jason worked as a Capitol reporter for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and the Wisconsin State Journal. He is the author with Patrick Marley of More Than They Bargained For, Scott Walker Unions and the Fight for Wisconsin. And he's been recognized by many journalism groups across the country and the state. So today, Rob and Jason will share insight into their newest report, as you see on your screen, Dollar for Dollar, which is a deep dive into the spending side of the municipal budget equation and how Wisconsin state and local government compares to the nation. Following their presentation, there will be a panel of local elected officials, including Tom Barrett, Mayor of the City of Milwaukee, David Crowley, County Executive of Milwaukee County, Cavalier Johnson, President of Milwaukee Common Council, and Marcelia Nicholson, Chairman of Milwaukee County Board of Supervisors. So Rob and Jason, I'd like to now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Congratulations to you. You know, now that you have all this free time in your hands, maybe we'll have to recruit you for our board of directors. So maybe you'll be hearing from me. Also, congratulations to Ellen and Manpower for your honors. What we're going to do, Jason and I are going to tag team, give you a little bit of background information that will be pertinent to the panel discussion. Then we want to bring our elected leaders on, of course, to have that conversation. Also, please feel free to use the Q&A to submit any questions you may have. I can't promise that we'll get to all of them, but we can certainly try to get to a few. So I'm going to start off by just providing a little bit of background on sort of how we got to this report looking at local government spending. So let me try to advance my slides, which does not seem to be working. Give me 1 second, please. Here we go. So I think this is a report cover with which many of you are familiar. This is a report that the forum released in 2017. The Greater Milwaukee Committee sponsored it and in fact has been a sponsor for all of the research that we'll be talking about. So thank you very much to the entire GMC for that. So On the Money was a report that really received a great deal of attention at the time. It dug very deeply into the revenue structure for the city of Milwaukee government and compared that to a bunch of peer cities. And what we found is captured on this slide. I don't think any of us were surprised, and my guess is that none of you in the audience would be real surprised to learn that Milwaukee has a lot of dependence on the property tax. But what this slide is showing, which we produced again in 2017, is that at that time, as if you looked at the property tax as a share of local tax revenue for a group of 39 peer cities. So this peer group is every city in the United States with a population between 300,000 and 1 million, We did have to exclude a handful that either were combined city-county governments or that also finance their school districts. But we had a nice, healthy peer group, as you can see on this slide, of 39. And what we are looking at here is property tax as a share of all local tax revenue. And what stands out, of course, is that not only is Milwaukee #1 among the 39 in terms of its reliance on the property tax, but it's #1 by a very wide margin. And really, I could argue that this 96% that you're seeing should be 100% because business improvement and tax incremental district funding comprises a large portion of that remaining 4%, and arguably those are also derived from the property tax. So what we see here is that not only are we heavily reliant on the property tax, but we are certainly unique in that regard among similar sized peer cities across the country. Where we are also unique, here we're not #1, but we're #3, is in the dependence that our city government has on revenue from the state of Wisconsin. And most of that revenue comes from the state's shared revenue program. As you can see, when you look at state funding as a share of combined intergovernmental and local tax revenues, we're at 48%. Again, not #1, #3, and far above the average of this peer group. Why is this problematic? Well, it's a lot of money. And so the city's shared revenue payment from the state is about close to $230 million per year. The problem is that amount of money has not gone up in at least 20 years. So again, on the one hand, there's this very heavy reliance. On the other hand, reliance on a funding source that simply hasn't grown over time. So those are some key distinctions that we looked at with regard to the city of Milwaukee. We wanted to take our research then a step further. We wanted to look at, in general, the municipal revenue structure in the state of Wisconsin and how Wisconsin compared to the other 49 states. So we looked in this study that came out in 2019 called Dollars and Cents at the revenue structure for municipalities as a whole. We're presenting it a little differently in this slide. This is looking at each of these revenue sources as a share of the total. But as you can see, what is consistent is that when compared to the US average, municipal governments in the state of Wisconsin far more reliant on property taxes, far less reliant on sales taxes. What's interesting here is when you look across the municipalities, unlike just the city of Milwaukee, our dependence on state aid is much closer to the US average. But still, this reliance on the property tax and very little use of other sources of local taxation clearly is a finding that was retained as we spread it across all municipalities, in this case, cities and villages, actually, not towns, in the state of Wisconsin. So as we put out both of these reports, one of the common questions that we got asked in response was, okay, Wisconsin Policy Forum, you've pointed out some distinctions in terms of our revenue structure, but what about the spending side? How do we compare to other states when it comes to spending? And before you tell us that we have a revenue problem that ought to be addressed, what can you tell us about whether we also have a spending problem? And so that leads us to a report that we released last month. I'm now going to turn it over to Jason Stein, our research director, to walk you through very briefly some findings from that report.
Great. Thank you, Rob. And thanks to the GMC for both having us here and to talk about this research and for sponsoring it in the first place. So when we look at local and government spending in Wisconsin, the first thing you have to understand is you really can't look at it in isolation. And the reason is simple. Every state has a little different breakdown in terms of responsibility at the state and local level for services like parks, police, libraries, things like that. And what you really care about is what is the level of service and what is the cost of the service to the public, as opposed to which level of government is actually delivering it. And so that was something that we tried to control for or account for as we did our study. And you can see more what I mean by that as I go along in the presentation. Okay, quickly, the report has an introduction. It has a historical analysis that basically looks at, most of my lifetime, what's been happening for spending in certain key areas in Wisconsin by local governments in Wisconsin. Then we look at 2017 data, which is a year from the Census Bureau that you can get very complete and accurate data for. It looks at does a comparison of local and state spending in Wisconsin to other states around the country. And then there's a discussion of, well, what does this all mean? What are the implications? What are things that policymakers should consider as they go into things like the state budget that's about to really kick off next week? So here you see state and local spending in Wisconsin over, the last generation. And what you see is that the gap between the share of that spending has really narrowed as the state has started to take on more and more of the overall spending, and local governments are taking less. This is not the amount of the spending. This is the amount of the spending has been going up because of inflation and other factors, but this is what is the breakdown of it. Obviously, there's a number of things that are happening here. There are levy limits on property taxes. There are school revenue limits. Those have had a big impact in terms of slowing local spending growth. The state has had greater growth in taxes like the income tax and spending pressures in certain areas like Medicaid in particular. And so those are some of the things that are happening there. You go ahead to the next slide. It is worth noting that even though the state has really almost caught up to local governments in terms of the share of overall spending in Wisconsin, we are still somewhat unusual nationally in relying more on local governments than the state government to deliver key services. And again, that is what we really care about, is the overall spending and level of service. But you can see here that for both local and state spending, we are below average in Wisconsin. Our ranking is a little bit higher at the local level than at the state level, but we are below the national average for both, and in the roughly middle of the pack for states. Okay, so here's a slide that really helps you when you say, well, Jason, what does it mean to say that our state relies more on local governments to deliver key services? This is a great example. So what this is per capita spending on police at the state and local level combined by state. And what you can see is that Wisconsin ranks 23rd overall, but within that very middle of the pack ranking at the state local level, there's a real variation in terms of levels of government. So you can see that at the municipal level, Wisconsin ranks 8th highest nationally for spending on police. And at the state level, we rank dead last. And so when you combine those two things, we're average, but we get to sort of an average spending in a very unusual way. And why would this matter? I mean, this could matter, in the context of after the killing of George Floyd, you had some discussion about how much cities like the city of Milwaukee spend on police protection. And obviously that's an important debate to have. But one key piece of context to understand is when you're thinking about how much do we as a society in Wisconsin or in the greater Milwaukee area spend on police, that although it's high for the level of cities and villages, it tends to be much lower at the state level and so forth. And you see this with some other the services like parks would be another example of that. Okay, just to keep this moving, our spending is also affected by some of the unique geography and culture of Wisconsin. Here you see police departments, per capita spending on police departments and the share of fire departments in a state that are volunteer. And you see that our spending is low on fire and EMS services in Wisconsin, and our percentage of volunteer fire departments is high. So that gives us low spending. Now, if you have a huge fire in your small rural community, or you have several people that are having heart attacks at once, there's implications for the kind of service you're going to get at those difficult times, but it is cheaper. Other things, we have winter weather in Wisconsin, very harsh, that we're really feeling that this week. That tends to really increase spending on roads. And then we also have other things like, our communities are pretty evenly distributed around the state. We have a high share of high number of rural road miles. All those things can impact spending. Okay, so what should we take away from all this? Well, one thing to think about as we put more and more, I think, pressure on revenues and spending at the local level, that to remember that those are the very government entities that we are depending on to deliver services like libraries, like police, fire, parks, that sort of thing. So if they're, the state government in Wisconsin does not have a big institutional role right now where it could take any of the pressure off those local governments. Certainly, as policymakers, one thing that lawmakers and the governor could consider is having this, government take on more responsibility in those areas, or in, some of those areas. Wouldn't have to be all of them. That would be certainly one option. And I think, as you know, the Policy Forum doesn't advocate for or against specific policies, but we try and offer thoughtful suggestions. Another option that obviously has gotten a lot of, I think, consideration from the people on this call is the idea of a local option sales tax or other steps that you could do to increase revenues at the local level. Obviously, as we have a number of local governments in Wisconsin, we're high for just simply how many local governments we have. So that is also something to think about in terms of service sharing and local collaboration, which is something that Rob has done a ton of research on at the Policy Forum. We can look at ways at the state level to incentivize cooperation at the local level, or at the very least, to not have disincentives to cooperation at the state level. And then finally, one thing that I always point out is, as policymakers, state and local officials always have the option of doing nothing, but there's sometimes a fallacy that if we do nothing, we'll get the status quo, will just continue forever. Well, obviously that's not the case, because things go on and change whether government acts or not. And what I think you could potentially see is a continued increase in reliance on the property tax at the local level, as well as continued pressure on services like police and libraries, if we have these trends continue on as they have. So thanks very much, and we'll take questions if there are any.
So Heather, I think if we stop sharing the screen, we can bring the panelists out. And actually, again, we urge you to submit any questions that you may have, either for the forum or for our panelists. My sense is you may have more questions for them once they come on. In the meantime, I'm going to get started by moderating some discussion with our very illustrious panel of leaders from our city government and our county government. So welcome, panelists. I'm going to dispense with any more formal introductions. I know everybody knows who all of you are. Let's get right to the questions. And let's get started with your reaction to the findings that Jason just described regarding the forum's latest report. I think what it really highlights is sort of this double whammy faced by local governments, particularly your two governments in the state of Wisconsin. Very limited local revenue options, yet very heavy local government responsibilities. Sort of counterintuitive, the two of them. So I'm wondering, first of all, were you surprised at that finding, particularly when we compared our governments to the rest of the country? And how does that finding impact your pitch to the state for a local option sales tax? So that's my question. Mayor Barrett, I'm going to start with you. No offense, but you've been grappling with these issues for a little bit longer than your colleagues. So let's hear from you first.
Well, thank you very much, Robin. Thank you for the great report, and congratulations to the award winners. And David, congratulations to you for your service to the organization. everything was fine till you got here, just so you know. But congratulations. So was I surprised? No, I wasn't surprised. There were a couple of things that surprised me a little bit. My overall reaction is sort of the guy who died, and on his tombstone he has inscribed, "I told you I was sick." Because we have been saying for years that the fiscal relationship between the city of Milwaukee and state government is broken, and we need to set the reset button. And I know the county is facing different problems, but also some serious problems. And so we have literally for years been trying to make the case that this just is not working. I would say the two things that jumped out at me, and I don't know if you can bring up the slide again real quickly, but the slide that shows that we're, I think, 12th in the country in local spending for police, yet 50th for state spending on police. And health, I think we were relatively high for local spending, I think 6th highest for local spending, and then 48th highest on state spending. So it tells you that these two incredibly vital functions, public safety and health, local government is carrying the load. And we've seen absolutely no help in terms of an increase from state government in these two critical areas. And so for the last couple of sessions, when I've gone to the state legislature, I haven't gone there to make threats. I haven't gone there to blow smoke. I have simply gone there to tell them, look, this is our situation. If we don't get additional revenue, we are going to have fewer police officers. One year it was 80 fewer police officers. This year it was 120 fewer police officers. And so those were not philosophical decisions, those were fiscal decisions. So the city of Milwaukee has 200, this year, at the end of this year, we'll have 200 fewer police officers than it did just 3 years ago. And that tells you the impact this is having. And it's not only that area, but it's an area of health, it's an area of housing, where we're at a point now where we look to the federal government more for assistance than we do for state government. And I think that that's a sad statement.
So let me turn to you now, and thank you, Mayor Barrett, County Executive Crowley. So you obviously came to your position from state government. You've been engaged with colleagues on both sides of the aisle in that position, talking about some of Milwaukee County and City of Milwaukee's unique problems. A report now comes out that would appear to indicate that when it comes to spending, we're roughly middle of the pack. Do you think that that will surprise your colleagues? And what do you think that this research, again, what type of impact does this have on your ability now to try to get something done in this next state budget regarding some type of fiscal relief?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for the report, Rob, the Wisconsin Policy Forum. Thank you, GMC. Congratulations to David, chairing your last meeting, and congratulations to Ellen and Manpower as well. But honestly, when you look at this report, this really reinforces what we already know. And I think it would, many of my colleagues would say they've been doing everything to keep spending down at the state level, but it's not trickling down to everybody else. And so, in the past 10 plus years, you have seen many communities across the state of Wisconsin go to a binding referendum to increase their property taxes because they know that there is a need to invest locally. And so there is a statewide need for more local options, and the financial challenges that are facing communities like ours. But when you think about all the large and small communities, urban or rural, they have a real impact on how each of us seeks to invest in our local priorities. And so we have to remember that Wisconsin counties are very unique compared to other counties across the country, as you pointed out, which is we require counties to provide both local and state services. And this has a disproportionate impact on Wisconsin counties, especially right now when you think about us responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. But this also gives us a lot of limitations because we don't have the ability to raise revenue to really meet these growing needs. And so we are unable to proactively invest in the programs and services that could literally not only mitigate this pandemic, but really put people in a prime position to thrive. And so this is something that we're going to have to continue to talk to the Republican-controlled legislature about, as well as the governor administration, about the need for local governments needing more dollars.
Thank you. Council President Johnson, I want to turn to you. I'm interested not only in your general reaction to the report, But in particular, I'd be interested in your comments on the slide that Jason showed regarding police spending that the mayor mentioned as well. The finding that, again, when you look at municipal police spending, we certainly seem to be on the high side as a state in terms of our overall municipal spending. That doesn't speak specifically to the city, but clearly the city Milwaukee police budget is a big part of overall state municipal spending on police. How does that impact the conversations that are taking place right now at City Hall regarding the future of the police budget and whether there may be some opportunity to do some things in terms of diverting some funds to some other purposes?
Well, thank you, Rob, for the question. And as the county executive and the mayor said, congratulations to all the winners there, and to David on successful 2 years of chairing the GMC. My general reaction to the report was that it wasn't really all that surprising because we've been singing this tune for some years now about the need for greater state support and flexibility for local revenues. We constantly speak in terms of how Milwaukee is an outlier, really, in terms of large American cities, and that our state government is unique and that it starves us to keep pace with raising revenues to deliver services that our citizens both expect as well as deserve. In relation to the police spending, that's an excellent question. The mayor was mentioning this during our own budget process, and where we had a lot of pressure from community groups to defund the police or abolish the police or significantly reduce police spending to the tune of $75 million, which in essence would have cut the police department in Milwaukee in half. What he had said was that essentially the state government has already taken up that mantle of defunding the police by the mere fact that they are not making sure that local governments in Wisconsin, and namely the city of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County, have the revenue options necessary to keep up with the cost to continue services, including for police funding. So in terms of the state funding piece for police, that certainly is an area where they could step in and help local governments, especially ours, to be able to relieve some of the financial pressures that we face, and not just in police, but in so many other areas as well, as identified in the report too. Housing, economic development, as it relates to counties, parks, so many other areas where the state could step in and be a real partner for us at the local level.
Thank you, President Johnson. And last but certainly not least on this question, Chairwoman Nicholson, again, interested in any general response you have to the report, and also interested in your perceptions of just what type of response you think, first of all, that you've been getting so far and that you're anticipating. As Jason said, new state budget coming out next week. What's the state of affairs in your opinion in terms of your ability to talk to Madison and try to work collaboratively on some relief?
Thank you, Rob, and your staff for this report. I just want to start by thanking the Greater Milwaukee Committee for this honor of addressing you and your guests, and then also extending congratulations to Dave and Ellen. Thank you for all your amazing work in the community. So as it relates to this question, what I want to start with is our community deserves better than austerity cuts and being taxed to death. And I think we've made that known in our ask to state legislators. The report was not surprising to me. I'm aware of the long structural problems Milwaukee County has had that precedes me, even my birth at only 32 years old. But the last 5 years of my own involvement in Milwaukee County as a policymaker, we've had to cut important services annually to make our budgets whole. And we've also seen the impacts that increased spending and reduced shared revenue has had on our structural deficit long term. What I want to say I was surprised to hear was that we rank in the middle of the road, but I understand that it accounts for local spending and not enough state spending. But I was surprised to see that because the perception in Milwaukee is that we invest too much in urban communities. We invest too much in public services and not enough in enterprise or the private sector. So I thank you all for this well-reasoned, apolitical, very forward and succinct report that now gives us the data and the evidence that we need to take back to the state legislature and say, listen, roll back preemptive measures so that we can be innovative in local government, increase state shared revenue, and take on some of the responsibilities of funding important services that this entire state gets to interact with here in Milwaukee County in our local economy. But in terms of what I'm hearing, we were very fortunate to receive CARES funding this past budget cycle. And the community was very pleased to hear that instead of cutting essential services, we were able to add into and improve some of those services. But because we did not get that direct and flexible funding, and as Mayor Barrett said, because we have to consistently lobby the federal government for more funding, I'm afraid, and our constituents are afraid of what our budget will look like next year. But I'm optimistic, and I'm looking forward to working with the group of leaders on the call to make sure that we can get it done for Milwaukee County.
Thank you, Chairwoman Nicholson. And it provides a good segue into my next question. You mentioned the CARES funds, which for those in the audience who aren't aware, that's one of the primary forms of relief that the federal government sent down to states and to local governments. Let's stick with the county first. So a question for the Chairwoman and the county executive. When we assessed your budget for the 2021 budget last fall, sort of pleasantly surprised that because of those CARES funds, particularly for your transit system, but also for some other sources, you sort of, again, appeared to have sort of a reprieve, at least for the time being. We and others, many of your predecessors have now been warning for years about the real consequences if nothing changes for the county budget, yet it seems like every year somehow you find a way to scrape by. So can you just share with us a little bit just how dire is your financial situation and what's the outcome if there is not some type of relief, either through the state taking on greater responsibilities, as Jason mentioned, or again, providing some type of new local tax option or some other form of relief. So maybe let's start with you, County Executive Crowley. We'll then go back to you, Chairwoman Nicholson.
Great question. But when you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, it has really made the need for additional revenue even more urgent. I mean, when you think about this unprecedented challenge that we're all facing to keep our neighbors and our businesses safe, it's really shown that our funding structure, our revenue structure is extremely unsustainable. And it's really painted that picture. And we have to maintain a balanced budget. And so we need that additional revenue. We need that flexibility so we can provide the county government the stability that it requires to pay for the necessary service that so many folks need right now, not only just to address this pandemic, but through the recovery. And so, you know, this year we were able to plug our budget, but you have to remember year after year, Milwaukee County can see anywhere between $20 to a $30 million deficit. And we aren't seeing an increase in revenues. With everything that is shut down, we're not seeing program revenues or usual streams of revenues coming in that we usually see. And so we're going to have to rely heavily on both the state and federal government to help us get through this pandemic and through this recovery. But it's just to let folks know that we need more tools. You know, right now we're talking about the pandemic, but it does not mean that all of the issues facing even previous to this pandemic. I don't know why I am a little nervous today, but previous to this pandemic, but even now, you know, it's really exacerbated many of the issues that we have seen. And if we want to invest our dollars towards racial equity and health equity, it's going to take us having more tools in the toolbox to do exactly that. Especially as you mentioned, when you talk about our transit system, our mental health system, when you think about our park system, these are programs and services that many people need access to. And right now we're in a tough position to where we're going to have to make a lot of tough choices in the near future without a local option 1% sales tax.
And Chairwoman Nicholson, just would ask you to briefly weigh in on that one as well, but also is this the year that the parks really needs to take the hit, being one of the few discretionary programs and services left in county government?
Thank you, Robin. I'm glad you mentioned it, and I will be brief. But county executive, I don't know why you're nervous, because this is like, you're amazing at this. So, but very briefly, I think the county executive put it in a nutshell. But we basically have a structural deficit issue that's baked into a system of inflation, where inflation increases twice the amount that our revenue does. And so, because we only have property taxes, fees, and services to rely on to fund our services, it really does put us at a disadvantage. It is important to note, though, because, and I read this in the report, because Wisconsin does rely on property taxes, our budget during the pandemic was a little bit more stable than other local governments would have had. However, we really need to stop overtaxing our community in order to publicly fund our services. In terms of parks, I'm glad you mentioned that, because parks is one of those departments that have moved towards a revenue model where a majority of their budget comes from revenue that they raise from parks facilities, from events, from rentals, etc. But because of the pandemic, there was no use there. And so we were not able to raise the revenue. And that puts right there a spotlight on the type of structural deficit that we have that is long-term and is only exacerbated by the pandemic. So I really do think the state legislature should heed our call and really focus on this report and take to heart the recommendations that you put forth, because that's really what we're going to need. Those increased, you know what, I'll use a word for the business community, diversify. We need to diversify our revenue streams so that we can have a sustainable county government.
Thank you. So let's turn back to our city leaders. City was not as fortunate as the county in terms of the degree of difficulty of your 2021 budget. So you got through it. Obviously, there was an impact on police department staffing, but this is really just the tip of the iceberg. You face a huge potential increase in your pension contribution coming up as soon as 2023. So let's start with you, Mayor Barrett. I mean, what are the consequences if nothing changes in terms of your overall financial dynamic?
Well, we're already seeing the consequences in several different areas. One that I think many of the people in your audience here would understand is, and I hate saying this, as the mayor of the city of Milwaukee, we saw our Standard & Poor's rating drop 2 notches. And no mayor wants to ever talk about that, because it means that we are clearly distressed. And if you look at the causes of the distress, they point to our economy. They point to the fact that we're operating on a deficit in the general fund. And that's happening because we're drawing down on our reserves. And as you said in your initial comments, when you have one of your 2 major funding streams stagnant for 20 years, of course that's going to have an impact. It would have an impact on any single organization that anyone in this room is operating. You simply cannot have that major source of revenue stagnant for 20 years. And when I say stagnant, I'm not talking about growing at the rate of inflation or things like that. I'm saying it's not growing at all, period. So you've got that, and then you've alluded to our pension issue that's coming up in 2023. And the criticism of us is that we lack a plan to sufficiently address the obligation. And that's true, because we clearly have to partner with the state to be able to come up with the tools to address this. We legally do not have the tools to address these issues right now. So we are now at the point where this is not a decade off, it's not 5 years off. This is all coming in the next year or 2 where it's going to come to a head. So my hope is that the business community and the people who are part of GMC will partner with us. And I think the value of this report, far beyond anything else, it's obviously, it's credible, but you have the integrity and the believability. When I go there, or when other city or county leaders go there, they sort of don't hear us anymore. Your voice can still be heard, and that's why it's such a powerful voice.
Thanks, Mayor Barrett. President Johnson, how do you size up for your constituents and for your colleagues on the Common Council, many of whom are relatively new? You know, what's within your power to try to fix here, such as the pension problem, versus where you just need help from state government?
Yeah, thank you. I think no matter if you are new or if you're a veteran on the Common Council, when you mention the year 2023, it's a looming date that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up if you are in a leadership position in city government. And it does that because we unfortunately have been put into a position where our backs are up against the wall. And we've tried to continue to have these sort of conversations, and we need to continue to have these conversations to try to get the state to be able to come to the table to help the city of Milwaukee to address this mounting pension obligation, this mounting pension issue. But as was stated, I mean, there's no way that we can overcome this hurdle without true and significant partnership from state government. And so that's the message that I carry on myself, that members of the council understand too, is that we're in a really tough spot, and in order for us to be removed from that spot, we need the folks in charge that could give us the tools to fix this problem, to actually be there to help us to do it. It's one thing to point fingers and say we don't like the city's doing X, Y, or Z. But these are real and serious issues that are going to impact service delivery. And without action on them, we're going to be in a position where, service delivery continues to get cut for the Wisconsin residents who live here, the full 10% of the state's population that lives within the corporate limits of the city of Milwaukee. And I think it's unfair to those folks to not be able to get the services that they both expect and deserve because the state is, taking some sort of position with the city of Milwaukee where they don't want to help for some reason or another, be it political or otherwise. So we've got to continue to make sure that that message is known, and try to work with the state to make sure that they can be the partners that they need to be, that we need them to be, that these citizens in our city need them to be in order to solve these problems.
We are running out of time, so I want to leave with one last question. I'm going to have to ask each of you to be brief, which is not going to be fair once you hear my question. But it strikes me, I've been at this for a very long time, and I can't remember the last time that 3 of the 4 top positions in our city and county were by people, filled by people who are new to those positions, who are young, who are African American. And one of the things that has always frustrated me in the forum is there have been times where there hasn't been great cooperation between the city and the county. So in 20 seconds or less for each of you, we'll go back in reverse order, start with Chairwoman Nicholson. Very, very quickly, how do you assess the relationship between the city and the county, and are you encouraged that this could be an era of new cooperation between the two governments?
Rob, this is a new era of local government. I am elated to be serving amongst this slate of leadership. I will state that in terms of collaboration and service sharing, Will Milwaukee Task Force I proposed last spring. I hope now that we have more data and information that we can use that as a vehicle to collaborate more across the city of Milwaukee and within the Milwaukee Public Schools District. But yes, it is a new era of government, a new style of leadership. There's lots to come, and I'm very optimistic for the future. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Let's go to you next, President Johnson.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rob. I fully concur with the comments by Chairwoman Nicholson. Look, we know each other. We're friends. The 3 of us who are millennials, who are the principal leaders here in Milwaukee County. There's nothing but upside in the future for us to be able to work together. And I think outside of that, there have been areas where the city and the county have historically worked well together. For instance, in conveyance of tax foreclosed properties, newer ways in terms of the CART program where we pair law enforcement with mental health professionals, the doula program, and others. But there are some other places too that I think in the future we'll be able to work together even more so on infrastructure, perhaps even snow removal, things like that. And I've got no doubt that we'll be able to put things together when we work together.
Great.
Thanks for having us, Rob.
County Executive Crowley.
Well, I'm just ecstatic about having a working relationship with both the chairwoman, the president, and the mayor. I talk to at least one of them on a regular basis, all of them on a regular basis, to be quite frank with you. And so I'm really excited about the partnership, and I have to thank the mayor for his partnership and leadership as we continue to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic, but also as we think about the One Milwaukee, Move Milwaukee Forward coalition. We've been partnering with the city, other municipalities, as well as business leaders and community leaders about the need that we all have in increasing our revenue. So I'm really excited, not only just about this particular initiative, but others to come.
Thank you. And Mayor Barrett, you get the last word.
Well, first of all, I'm a little offended you don't consider me young, but I'll let that go. I'll let that go. But I love the energy. Obviously, there's a lot of energy, and it is accurate to say that we work well together right now. And I just hope the honeymoon continues. Again, I think the more we can speak with one voice, the stronger we are. And that's always what I wanted to do, was to be able to have the city and the county coming together, because I think there is such a mutuality in our interests that it makes sense for us to act together.
Thank you. And thank you, all of our panelists. Thanks again to the GMC. And I'll turn it back to you, David.
Okay, thank you, Rob. I want to thank you and Jason and our elected officials for sharing this important information. This is an urgent issue. It's been a priority of the GMC for several years. I think the fact that we have 3 young millennials and new leadership is bringing some added energy. We are in touch with the governor on this issue. We're working now with outstate elected officials to make this a statewide issue, not a Milwaukee City and County issue. And it is something that we feel change needs to occur in the next year or two. Politics is difficult and challenging, but if we collaborate and really work closely together, hopefully success will be ahead of us.